Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive. You know those awkward situations, those issues everyone sees but no one wants to talk about?
Oh, yeah.
That's what we're diving into today, these elephants in the room.
Oh, yeah.
We're looking at an episode from the FutureFit organization's podcast it's called The Elephant in the Room, Tackling the Issues We Avoid.
Makes sense.
And I think we've all been there, right? Like you're in a meeting and there's this huge GE problem, but everyone's just tiptoeing around it.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like that awkward silence, it's so thick you could cut it with a knife.
Yeah, exactly. It's crazy how much tension these unaddressed issues can cause, right?
Yeah.
And ignoring them, well, that can be, it can really hurt an organization. But on the flip side, if you actually confront these elephants, that can lead to some serious growth and positive change.
It's interesting, though, right? Because this whole elephant in the room thing, it's not just limited to businesses or organizations. Like, think about it. You see this in families all the time, right? Avoiding those tough conversations about finances, or maybe there's some family drama that everyone's just pretending isn't happening.
Yeah, totally. Or even like a group of friends where there's a growing conflict, but everyone's just, I don't know, sweeping it under the rug to avoid confrontation.
Exactly. It's like this unspoken agreement to just keep things, keep them buried, even though it's causing all this underlying tension.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Like the podcast really gets into why we do this. Like, why do we avoid these elephants? And they break it down to like three main reasons. Fear of conflict, which makes sense, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a big one for a lot of people.
Then there's loyalty to the past. You know, that whole we've always done it this way mentality.
Yeah, the good old if it ain't broke, don't fix it approach.
Yeah. And then sometimes it's just that the problem feels so big, so overwhelming, like you don't even know where to begin to tackle it. So you just kind of avoid it altogether.
It can be pretty paralyzing.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not always about being like malicious or anything, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just easier to keep things the same, especially if things seem to at least be working on the surface.
Right. It's that whole don't rock the boat mentality. But what we often forget is that these avoided issues, they rarely stay contained. It's kind of like a small leak in a pipe, right? If you ignore it, it's only going to get worse and end up costing you way more to fix down the line.
Yeah. And the podcast actually brings up a really good example of this. They talk about the fall of Nokia.
Nokia. Wow, takes you back, right?
I know, right? Remember when they were like the name in mobile
Oh,
phones?
yeah, totally. Back when Snake was like the coolest game around.
Exactly. But what happened was Nokia was so successful with their traditional phone model that they completely missed the boat when smartphones started to take off.
Right. They were so focused on what had worked for them in the past that they didn't adapt to the changing market.
So basically, they were blinded by their own success, didn't even see that giant touchscreen elephant in the room.
Yeah, pretty much. And in the end, it cost them their dominance in the market. It's a cautionary tale for sure for any organization, big or small. Just because you've been successful in the past doesn't mean you can just sit back and relax. You got to be aware of the changing landscape and be willing to evolve with it.
I remember hearing Simon Sinek, the leadership expert, talk about this once. He said, it's not about beating your quarterly estimate. It's about being here in 10 or 15 years. And that really stuck with me.
It's a great point. It's about building something that lasts, right?
Oh.
Not just chasing those short-term wins, but creating something that can adapt and thrive over time.
Yeah. And if you're ignoring these critical issues that are holding you back,
Yeah.
well, that's just going to undermine your long-term vision.
It's like building a house on a shaky foundation.
Yeah.
Eventually, it's all going to come crumbling down. So, all right, we've talked about the risks of ignoring these elephants, but how do we actually confront them? The podcast talks about this really cool idea of an MRI for the soul of a business.
Yeah, the MRI for the soul. Okay, I like that.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful analogy, right? Like an MRI can scan your body and detect hidden issues. This MRI for the soul is about taking that same kind of deep, honest look at your organization. It's asking those tough questions like, what's working, what's not? Are there any potential problems brewing under the surface?
So it's like getting a clear diagnosis before those issues turn into major problems.
Exactly. And it all starts with being honest with yourself, being willing to face those uncomfortable truths that might be holding you back. And that's where a lot of organizations stumble.
Right, because no one really wants to admit that their company might have some issues.
Yeah.
But the podcast tells this great story about a CEO who did just that. He wanted that MRI for his company, even though everything seemed to be going great on the surface.
Yeah. What happened? What they find?
Well, it turns out there were some pretty big elephants hiding in plain sight. Like they discovered this toxic culture that had developed within their mid-management level. And then there was their system. It was this old, outdated system that was absolutely killing their efficiency. Everyone knew it, but no one was talking about it.
Ah, the classic case of elephant avoidance. So what happened when they finally acknowledged these issues? Did confronting them make things worse?
Actually, that's where it gets really interesting. By facing those issues head on, the company saw some amazing improvements. Like their efficiency went way up there, their employees were happier, and they even started innovating in ways they hadn't before.
So confronting the elephant actually helped them grow stronger.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to remember what the podcast emphasizes. Confronting these issues doesn't mean you're trying to blame anyone or create chaos. It's about fostering honest conversations, committing to those regular checkups, and being adaptable. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll dig into how to actually put these principles into practice.
Welcome back. So we talked about how important it is to acknowledge those elephants in the room, right? Like it's crucial for success in the long run, not just in business, but in life too.
Totally. But the big question is, how do we actually confront these issues? It can be pretty daunting, especially when they're uncomfortable to talk about.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's one thing to recognize the elephants there, but actually addressing it, that's a whole different ballgame. The good news is the podcast gives us some really solid advice. They outline 3 key steps to make that process a little less, well, a little less scary.
Okay, 3 steps. Let's hear them.
So step 1 is all about honesty, creating a culture where people feel safe to speak their minds.
Okay, honesty. I like that.
Yeah. It's about building that environment where people can share concerns, offer constructive criticism, without being afraid of getting in trouble.
That makes a lot of sense because if people are too scared to even point out the elephant, you're never going to be able to address it.
Right. It's like you're in a meeting and you can see something's not quite right, but you don't say anything because you don't want to rock the boat or come across as negative.
Oh, yeah. Totally been there. So
Yeah.
we got to move away from that kind of culture. But how do we actually do that? Is it just about telling people to speak up?
It's a bit more than that. It really starts at the top with leadership.
Ooh.
When leaders are willing to admit their own mistakes, when they actively seek feedback and show that they value honesty, that creates a ripple effect throughout the entire organization.
So it's about leading by example,
Yeah.
showing that it's okay to be vulnerable and admit that things could be better.
Exactly. And it's not about complaining or being negative for no reason. It's about creating a space for open and honest communication, where feedback is seen as a tool for growth, not a personal attack.
Okay, I get that. But even with a culture of honesty, wouldn't we still be reacting rather than being proactive? Like, wouldn't we still be waiting for these elephants to become huge before we address them?
That's where step 2 comes in. Regular checkups. Remember that MRI for the soul analogy. This is all about making those MRIs a routine part of your organization, like a regular health checkup.
So instead of waiting for things to blow up, we should be proactively checking in on the health of the organization.
Exactly. Identify those potential problems early on and have those tough conversations before they turn into full-blown crises.
Okay, I like it. And how often are we talking about? Like, what do these checkups look like?
It can vary depending on the organization, right? It could be regular team meetings with dedicated time for open discussion, or maybe anonymous surveys to gather feedback, or even bringing in an outside consultant for a fresh perspective. The key is finding what works best for your organization and making it a consistent habit.
Okay, so honesty and regular checkups. Got it.
Sure.
So what's the third piece of the puzzle?
Adaptability. Being able to adapt is key. Remember what happened with Nokia? They couldn't adapt, and it cost them big time. Organizations that really thrive, they're the ones that can embrace change, pivot when they need to, and constantly evolve.
So it's about being flexible, like building that muscle that allows you to bend without breaking. But how do we actually become more adaptable? That sounds a lot harder than it probably is.
It takes work, for sure, but it starts with cultivating a growth mindset. That applies to individuals and the organization as a whole. It's about seeing challenges not as threats, but as opportunities to learn and grow.
So it's a shift in perspective, seeing change as something positive, a chance to get better. But how do we actually put that into practice, like in a work setting?
Think about a team that sees feedback as valuable information, not criticism. They're more likely to experiment, try new things, and make adjustments when things aren't working. It creates a culture of continuous improvement, always striving to do things better.
Makes sense. So it's about building that culture where learning is encouraged and change is just seen as a natural part of the process.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, confronting those elephants, it's not about tearing things down. It's about building a stronger, more resilient organization that can face challenges head on and come out even stronger on the other side.
Yeah, it's like making sure your foundation is solid so that you can weather any storm that comes your way.
Right. And this doesn't just apply to businesses either. Think about the elephants in your personal life, too, in your relationships with family, friends, even with yourself. Addressing those issues with honesty and being open to adapting, that can lead to stronger connections and a more fulfilling life.
So many great insights here. I'm curious, though, do you have any real-world examples of how these principles have actually played out in an organization, like a story or something?
Yeah, actually, I do. There's this really fascinating story about a tech startup that faced their elephant head on and saw some incredible results.
I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Okay, so imagine this. We've got this tech startup, let's call them InnovateX. And they're experiencing explosive growth, like everything's going great. They're attracting top talent, investors are pouring money into them, everyone's celebrating their success. But under the surface, there's this problem brewing, a big culture-shaped elephant in the room.
Okay, so we've got this tech startup, InnovateX. They're doing amazing, but there's this culture problem, this elephant in the room. What was going on?
Well, things had gotten super competitive, almost toxic, Employees were like pitted against each other. There wasn't much teamwork, and people were getting burned out left and right.
Yikes. So not a great environment.
Not really. But the leadership team, they were so focused on all the growth and the success that they didn't really see the problem, at least not right away.
It's easy to get caught up in the numbers, right?
Yeah, for sure. They were so focused on the destination that they didn't really check if they were even on the right path.
So how did they finally figure out that they had this elephant to deal with? Did someone finally say something?
Yeah, it actually took a really brave employee to speak up. He was a senior engineer, and during an all-hands meeting, he just laid it all out. He talked about the toxic culture, the lack of teamwork, how it was affecting everyone.
Wow, that's pretty brave. What happened? Did anyone listen?
You know what? They did. To their credit, the leadership team really listened. They realized that he wasn't just complaining, he was bringing up something super important that could really hurt the company in the long run.
That's great. So what did they do?
Well, they took action right away. They started doing anonymous surveys to get feedback from everyone, held workshops on teamwork and communication, and they even brought in a consultant from outside to help them work through everything.
So they basically did that MRI for the soul that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And it really paid off. Once they started acknowledging the elephant and actually working on things, the whole company culture shifted.
Really? Like what kind of changes did they see?
Well, people started collaborating more, communicating better, and employee morale went way up.
That's awesome. So by facing the elephant, they didn't just solve the problem. They made things even better than before.
Exactly. And get this, their business results actually improved too. Innovation went up, they were more productive, and they were able to keep their employees around longer, all because they were willing to face that tough reality and do something about it.
That's a really inspiring story. It shows how powerful it can be to acknowledge and address those elephants in the room. It's not about dwelling on negativity or pointing fingers. It's about creating a healthier, more successful environment for everyone.
Absolutely. Ignoring the elephant won't make it go away. It's only going to make it bigger and harder to deal with later on. Facing it head on, even when it's tough, is the only way to really succeed.
Well said. This whole conversation has been so insightful. I think the idea of elephants in the room is something we can all relate to, whether it's at work, in our relationships, or even just within ourselves.
Totally. We all have those areas where we might be avoiding a difficult conversation or a necessary change. It's important to be aware of those elephants and be willing to address them.
It's definitely not always easy, but it can be incredibly rewarding.
For sure. It takes courage and honesty, but the results can be amazing, both personally and professionally.
I think that's a great note to end on. So to all our listeners out there, what elephants might be lurking in your life? Take some time to think about it. And remember, confronting those elephants might just be the key to your next breakthrough. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.